I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the envelope taped to my door. The paper, crisp and white, stood out like a thread against the dark wood. Thick red letters stamped across the front read, "Final Notice." Final notice I hadn't received. A first one. I peeled it off, unfolding the paper with a sense of dread clawing up my spine. Dear Mr. Carter, it has come to our attention that your property violates multiple HOA guidelines. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines and potential legal action. My stomach knotted as I scanned the absurd accusations. Unapproved structural elements. The well, my grandfather's well, was classified as a hazard, unkempt. Landscaping. I guess wildflowers didn't meet HOA's strict turfgrass standards. Non-conforming exterior aesthetic. Translation. My farmhouse wasn't the same shade of beige as the rest of the cloned suburban houses. And then the signature at the bottom, bold, pretentious, and underlined 3 times as if declaring itself. The law, Judith Mercer President, Ridge Homeowners Association. I let out a slow breath. Judith. Mercer. I'd only met her once when I first moved in. She had that unnerving, too wide smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the kind of woman who wore pastel cardigans but spoke in veiled threats. I should have known she'd be trouble. Still, this had to be a mistake. My house wasn't in the HOA. My grandfather's farmhouse had been here long before Maple Ridge swallowed up the surrounding land and turned it into cookie-cutter suburbia. I'd inherited it free and clear, outside HOA jurisdiction. I marched over to her house, a pristine, 2-story monstrosity with matching potted plants flanking the door, all the same unnatural shade of green. Before I could knock, the door swung open. Judith stood there, smiling that same empty smile. "Ah, Mr. Carter, I was just about to come see you." "You sent me a notice," I said, holding up the paper. "My property isn't under HOA control." Her smile didn't waver. "It's in the Maple Ridge community, isn't it?" "The community isn't the same as the HOA. My grandfather's property was legally exempt when the neighborhood was developed." She sighed, as if I were a child struggling with basic math. "That was years ago. Things change. It's about maintaining standards. Your standards don't apply to me." "Well," she said smoothly, "we'll see about that." Then she closed, the door in my face. The first fine arrived a week later. $500. The reason? Failure to remove unauthorized water structure. I crumpled the letter in my fist. The well. She was going after the well. My grandfather built it with his own hands. It had been there for generations, the stone edges worn smooth with time. It wasn't just a structure. It was a piece of history. And now Judith Mercer wanted it gone. I called her that night. She didn't answer. Instead, I got an email. "Mr. Carter, the well is a liability. The HOA has full discretion to enforce necessary safety measures. If you refuse to comply, further actions will be taken. Sincerely, Judith Mercer." Necessary safety measures? What the hell did that mean? Then the warnings started. Passive-aggressive notes appeared on my door. We wouldn't want any unfortunate accidents, would we? My mailbox disappeared. One morning, it was simply gone, ripped clean from the post. When I confronted Judith, she feigned surprise. "Oh dear, perhaps it wasn't securely installed." My trash bins vanished. My car was mysteriously towed. The escalation was slow, methodical. Little things, just enough to make life harder. Enough to make me question whether I was imagining it. I wasn't. The real blow came when I returned from a weekend trip. The moment I pulled into my driveway, something felt off. The air was thick with the acrid scent of drying cement. And then I saw it, the well, filled with concrete. The stones were still there, but the opening had been sealed shut. A heavy gray slab sat where the water once was, an ugly, deliberate act of destruction. I stumbled forward, fingers grazing the rough surface, my mind struggling to process it. A small sign was planted in the grass beside it. HOA approved safety ceiling. You're welcome. My vision went red. I spun on my heels and stormed across the street to Judith's house, pounding on the door. So hard the frame rattled. She answered after a long, deliberate pause, her expression eerily calm. Is there a problem, Mr. Carter? You... My voice shook with barely contained rage. You filled my well with concrete. She tilted her head, feigning innocence. Oh, that old thing? It was a hazard. Couldn't have someone falling in, now could. We? You had no right. Actually, she interrupted smoothly, the HOA has every right to enforce safety measures. We consulted with a contractor. The decision was final. I stared at her, heart pounding. You think you can just do whatever you want? Her smile widened. I know I can. A flicker of something dark passed through her eyes, satisfaction, amusement at my helplessness. And in that moment, I realized exactly what she was. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't about safety. This was about power. She enjoyed this. Seeing people squirm, watching them bend under her rules, knowing no one could stop her. Or so she thought. I forced my breathing to steady. My hands curled into fists at my sides, but I met her gaze with cold certainty. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Judith laughed. Actually laughed. Oh, Mr. Carter, I am the HOA. There's nothing you can do. I turned and walked away, heart hammering, mind racing. She thought she had won. She had no idea what was coming. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the thick slab of concrete outside my window, the moonlight casting sharp shadows over its surface. My grandfather's well, our family's history, entombed under an HOA directive, and she thought I would roll over. I pulled out every document I had, tracing my fingers over the faded deeds and legal exemptions. My property wasn't just outside HOA jurisdiction. It had been explicitly protected in contracts dating back decades. The well was part of that exemption, which meant Judith had overstepped. I just needed proof that would bury her. But Judith wasn't done. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. I rushed outside to find a tow truck parked in my driveway, and my truck, my goddamn truck, was hooked to it. What the hell are you doing? I shouted. The driver barely looked up from his clipboard. Got an order from the HOA. Non-compliant. Vehicle storage. Non-compliant. This is my driveway. Judith appeared from her perfectly manicured lawn, arms crossed, smile smug. You really should read the updated bylaws, Mr. Carter. Driveway parking is restricted to HOA-approved vehicles. Your truck is unsightly. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. I'm not in the HOA. She raised an eyebrow. Are you sure about that? Before I could respond, the tow truck lurched forward. My truck, my only vehicle, was yanked down the street, disappearing around the corner. I barely managed to stop myself from ripping her damn fence out of the ground. Instead, I exhaled, sharply, and turned away. She was trying to break me. She wanted to make me snap, but she didn't realize. She was the one walking into a trap. That night, I started digging. Not literally. The well was sealed, after all. But into the paper trail. Judith loved her rules, her little laws, her bureaucratic dictatorship. But the thing about people like her, they always assumed they were untouchable. They never considered someone like me might fight back. I scoured property records, old HOA meeting notes, even newspaper archives. And that's when I found it. A name I didn't expect to see. Judith Mercer hadn't always been Judith Mercer. She was a Monroe. Monroe. The same last name as the developers who tried to buy out my grandfather's land decades ago. A family feud, a grudge that went back further than I had imagined. This wasn't just about power. This was personal. And now that I knew, I wasn't just going to fight back, I was going to end her. The next day, my house was hit with another fine, $2,000 for disruptive landscaping. I walked outside and found HOA-approved contractors gutting my garden, ripping out the wildflowers, cutting down shrubs, leaving my yard a barren patch of dirt. I barely heard my own voice over the roar of the hedge trimmers. Get off my property. One of the workers hesitated. Ma'am said this was community property. It's not, I snapped, and if you don't leave now, "You're trespassing." A pause. Then, reluctantly, they packed up. But the damage was done, and across the street, Judith stood on her porch, watching, waiting. I met her gaze, and for the first time she smirked. I walked right up to her doorstep, my fists clenched at my sides. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" She leaned against the doorframe as if she had all the time in the world. "Enforcing community standards." "You mean harassment?" She feigned offense. "Oh, Mr. Carter, such strong words. You keep acting like this and people might start thinking you're—" She tapped a finger to her temple. "Unstable." A cold chill ran through me. That wasn't just a threat. That was a warning. She was setting the stage. A few more complaints, a little creative rewriting of events, and suddenly I wouldn't just be a nuisance. I'd be a danger to the community. She was trying to make me the villain. I forced myself to step back. "You think you can get away with this?" She chuckled. "I know I can." Then she shut the door in my face. I needed help, and I knew exactly where to find it. Later that night, I knocked on a door 3 houses down. An elderly man answered. Frank Gibbons, the longest-standing homeowner in the neighborhood. He had lived here before the HOA even existed. "You gonna stand there, or you coming in?" he muttered. I stepped inside, and the air smelled like old books and fresh coffee. "I need information." He gave me a knowing look. "About Judith?" I nodded. He sighed, settling into a worn leather chair. "I was wondering when you'd come around." I sat across from him. "You know something, don't you?" He hesitated. Then slowly, he nodded. "Not just something," he said. "Everything." My pulse quickened. "Tell me." He took a slow sip of coffee before he spoke. "Judith Mercer doesn't own her house." The words hit like a slap. "What?" He smirked. "She's not the rightful owner of that property. Never was." My mind raced. "Then who is?" He leaned forward, voice lowering. "It belonged to her mother, but when the old woman passed, there was a will dispute, one that was never legally settled." I felt my breath catch. "You're saying she's living there illegally?" "That's exactly what I'm saying." The room went silent. Then, slowly, a grin spread across my face. I had her. She just didn't know it yet. I sat back in Frank's worn leather chair, my pulse thrumming in my ears. "How sure are you?" He gave me a look. "Son, I don't open my mouth unless I'm damn sure." I nodded, mind already racing. "If Judith Mercer isn't the rightful owner of that house, then she's squatting on stolen property," he finished, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "And if that ever got out, well, let's just say the HOA president might find herself homeless." I exhaled slowly. I had her, but I couldn't use it yet. Not now. Not when she still had the upper hand. No, I needed her to think she was winning. I needed her to overplay her hand. So I waited. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, a letter was nailed to my front door. I yanked it free, skimming. The contents. "Mr. Carter, due to continued violations and failure to comply with community regulations, you are hereby ordered to appear before the HOA board for an emergency compliance hearing. Failure to appear will result in legal action." At the bottom, Judith's signature loomed, thick and confident. I let out a sharp laugh. She was actually trying to take me to trial. She wanted me in her domain, surrounded by her lapdogs, where she could control the outcome. Perfect. Let's see how that worked out for her. I arrived at the HOA hearing exactly 1 minute late, just enough to make Judith frown. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, a sterile beige room that smelled of stale, coffee and desperation. The long table at the center was flanked by Judith's hand-picked board members, all middle-aged and dead-eyed, nodding on command like trained parrots. Judith sat at the head, her hands folded in front of her like a queen preparing to pass judgment. Took my seat across from her. "Let's get this over with." Her smile was sharp. "Mr. Carter, do you understand the severity of your violations?" "Do you understand that my property isn't in the HOA?" I countered. Her eyes flashed. Your land exists within the Maple Ridge community, which means it must adhere to community standards. I leaned back. So tell me, Judith, when exactly did my exempt property become part of your jurisdiction? A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. The HOA has the authority to— No, I interrupted. You don't. That authority was never extended to my land. She exhaled sharply through her nose. This isn't about legal loopholes, Mr. Carter. It's about order. That word. Order. This was never about rules. It was about control. I smirked. Then let's talk about your compliance. Her smile faltered. Excuse me? I pulled a folder from my bag and slid it across the table. Public records, deeds, a little inheritance dispute that was never settled. Her face paled. You never legally inherited your house, did you? I pressed. Silence. The board members shifted uncomfortably. I wonder, I mused, tapping the folder, if the real owner of your property knew you were playing dictator from a house that isn't even yours. Enough! Her voice was sharp, cracking through the air like a whip. This meeting isn't about me. I sat back, letting the moment stretch. I wanted her rattled, angry, and I got exactly what I wanted. Her voice dropped into something cold, something dangerous. I suggest you think very carefully about what you say next, Mr. Carter. A threat. The board members watched, unsure, waiting for her to regain control. She had two choices: back down or go nuclear. I watched it happen, the moment she decided to burn everything down instead. She lifted her chin. I move that Mr. Carter be formally evicted from the community for non-compliance. The room went silent. Even her own board members hesitated. She kept going, words clipped and venomous. His presence disrupts Maple Ridge standards. His refusal to follow regulations poses a safety risk to the community. I stared at her. You're serious? She smiled, full of teeth. Let's put it to a vote, she said sweetly. For a moment, no. One moved, then slowly, hands rose, one by one, not all of them. But enough to make it real. Judith turned back to me, victorious. Mr. Carter, you have 30 days to vacate. The room spun around me. I'd underestimated her. She didn't care about legalities, about what was fair. She was gutting me in real time. I forced myself to stay. Calm, but I could barely hear over the rush of blood in my ears. I'd thought I had the upper hand, but Judith Mercer just played her trump card first. I stormed out of the clubhouse, fists clenched. 30 days. She had 30 days left before she found out exactly what it felt like to lose everything, but I had to move fast because Judith wasn't done. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of sirens. I ran outside. My house was surrounded by cops. A uniformed officer stepped forward, face unreadable. Mr. Carter? My pulse thundered. Yeah? He held up a clipboard. A goddamn restraining order. Ms. Mercer has filed a complaint against you for harassment, he said. Under the terms of this order, you're required to cease all contact and remain a minimum of 500 feet away from her property. My breath left my body. What? The officer's face remained neutral. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest. I turned my head, and there she was. Judith stood across the street, arms folded, watching with a smile. She had set me up. The board hearing wasn't her end game. This was. She had boxed me in, cut me off from fighting back. She wasn't just trying to take my house. She was trying to ruin my life. And for the first time, I felt it. Doubt. I'd played my hand too soon. I'd thought I had her in check. But now I was the one cornered. And Judith Mercer was standing over the board, waiting to call checkmate. I forced myself to breathe as the officer read out the conditions of the restraining order. My ears rang, my hands shook, but I kept my face blank. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Do you understand the terms, Mr. Carter? The cop asked. I swallowed the fire in my throat and nodded. Yeah, I understand. Good. I'd advise you to follow them carefully. I turned my head slightly, locking eyes with Judith across the street. She stood on her perfectly paved driveway, arms crossed, head tilted just slightly. That smile still in place, like she was savoring the moment. She had me. At least, she thought. She did, because what Judith didn't know was that her game was already over. I moved carefully over the next few days. I stayed out of sight. I made no more public moves. I let Judith believe I was defeated. And she got comfortable. Too comfortable. She threw herself a victory lap, strutting through the neighborhood like a queen. Word spread that I'd been removed from the community. That the unruly outsider had been dealt with. She didn't stop there. A foreclosure notice arrived at my door, a letter from a law firm claiming ownership of my land. She was trying to seize my property outright. That was it. That was her final, arrogant mistake, because Judith Mercer had spent years bullying people into submission, but she had never faced someone willing to go down swinging. The storm hit at the next HOA meeting. I wasn't allowed within 500 feet of Judith's house, but that didn't mean I was out of options. No, I had lawyers for that, and I had Frank Gibbons. The old man strode into that meeting and dropped the bombshell. Judith Mercer wasn't just a fraud. She was a squatter. Her house wasn't legally hers. It had been left in a legal limbo, a messy inheritance dispute after her mother passed. Judith had been living in the house on false pretenses and using her stolen position to run the HOA as her personal kingdom. The room erupted, shouting, gasps, board members demanding explanations. And the final blow? Frank had proof that Judith had used HOA funds for personal expenses. A felony. She tried to regain control, tried to talk over them. But this wasn't like the hearings where she could silence me. She had nowhere to run. By morning, the fallout was unstoppable. The real heirs of the house, Judith's estranged cousins, came forward with lawyers. With a lawsuit, Judith Mercer was evicted from her own house. She fought it, of course, raged, screamed. But the law wasn't on her side anymore, and neither was the neighborhood. The board turned on her. She was removed as HOA president by an emergency vote. And without her control, the floodgates opened. People started talking. Homeowners shared stories of harassment, of thousands of dollars in fake fines, of retaliatory property damage, of lives ruined by her reign. There was even a civil suit forming, an effort to recover. Stolen HOA funds. Judith Mercer had spent years believing she was untouchable. But now, she had nothing. The day she finally left was quiet. There were no sirens, no dramatic outbursts. Just a moving truck, a few remaining boxes. She didn't even look at me when she passed. Not that I expected her to, because the thing about dictators, they never handled defeat well. I stood in front of the well, staring at the ugly slab of concrete covering it. It had been weeks since Judith disappeared from Maple Ridge. The HOA had been gutted, the board restructured. The new president, someone actually decent, was already working to undo the damage. But the well? That was still here. I clenched my fists, then let out a slow breath, and smiled, because I had a sledgehammer and plenty of time. With the first swing, the concrete cracked. By the time the sun set, I could see water again, and with it, I saw the end of Judith Mercer's rule and the beginning of something better.